Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the first round of the knockout stage of Division 1 of the Julius Baer Generations Cup, which is part of the Champions Chess Tour and being held on chess.com. Now, in the first round, we have a very big matchup between the five-time world champion Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi from Russia, who is the runner-up in both the World Championship matches in 2021 as well as 2023. Now, these guys obviously have played a lot against each other, but it's always great when we see them compete. So the format is quite simple. They're playing 10 plus 2, 10 minutes with 2-second increment, best of 4 games. If it's tied 2-2 after 4 games, there will be the classic Armageddon. All right, so we're going to pick it up in game number 2 of the match. The first game was a pretty boring draw. Jan having the white pieces, Magnus with the black pieces. So it's half-half going into game 2, and let's take a look. So the game starts out with the move d4. Here we get the move knight to f6 from Jan. Magnus goes c4. We get e6. Knight to f3, d5, and now we have the move g3. Now, Magnus has played this Catalan opening a lot in recent times. He did, in fact, play it against Jan in the World Chess Championship match as well. We get pawn takes pawn, bishop g2, c5, and now we have the move queen a4 being played. Now, in their match in the World Championship, Jan played bishop e7, castles, and then we had this castles, queen c2, b5 variation, which at the time was very, very fresh, but now it's considered to be one of the main lines in the Catalan. So we get c5 from Jan, Magnus goes check, we get bishop e7, queen takes c4, and now we have the move b5 being played. Now this move might look a little bit awkward, but what black is trying to do is after queen c2 is played and black goes knight c6, you've kicked the queen away from the c4 square, but additionally now you have ideas to go knight takes d4 or knight b4, harassing the white queen even further on c2. So Magnus takes the pawn on c5, and now we get knight to b4, attacking the queen, and Magnus plays queen to d2. Jan plays bishop takes pawn on c5, and already it's looking kind of scary for white, because if you react poorly, let's just say you play a move like a3, out of nowhere, suddenly black can play bishop takes pawn. If you take the bishop, there's knight to e4, forking the king and the queen, and after king to f1, black can very smoothly move the knight to d5. You still can't capture the bishop due to the knight e4 fork, and with these knights jumping to the center of the board here, white is actually in a world of trouble. So Magnus goes knight to e5, basically preventing the move knight to e4 here from black. Jan plays rook to c8, dodging the rook hanging on this long diagonal. We now get the move knight to c3 from Magnus, and here bishop to d4 is played by Jan. Now, this is a very creative way of trying to force white to make a decision here. You're attacking the knight on e5, the knight on c3. Of course, it is a classic wooden shield as well. And if white were to take what looks like a free bishop, it's spaghetti-o. There's knight to c2, and we've reached the classic family fork. I'm forking the rook, I'm forking the king, and I'm forking the queen as well. So after bishop d4, Magnus takes the bishop on d7. We get queen takes knight, and now Magnus castles and Jan castles as well. Now, we're out of the opening phase here, but let's take some stock of the position. Black has some slight weaknesses on the queen side. The pawn on b5 can become a little bit weak. Also, additionally, I can kick the knight away from b4. And on top of that, I have the two b's here if I'm playing from the white side. Now, when you combine that with very good king safety for white, this is already looking like a Magnus Supreme, a typical position where it's a very small advantage, but Magnus will grind down his opponent. So we got the move knight e4 here. Jan plays knight c2, we got knight takes knight, g takes, and now we have rook b1. Now, it's worth pointing out that in this position, after knight to e4, what Jan should have played, or Nepo, I'm not sure which way I should refer to him, honestly, is he should have traded the knights on e4 and played this move f5. Now, probably he was worried about something like queen takes b4, f takes e4, and something like e3, where it looks like all these pawns are very, very weak. But in typical computer fashion, after bishop to f6, queen takes e4, for example, black can play a5 followed by rook c4, and because you have this bishop on c1 that can't move to d2, it's stuck guarding the pawn on b2, and black can create a double stack on the c file. The computer is giving black an advantage. Now, in a rapid or blitz game, frankly, I think, again, like many of these variations, it's not very realistic. So Jan goes knight c2, we get the trade. Now we have rook to b1, and the move rook fd8 is played. However, because Jan has not traded the knights on e4, now he has some slightly compromised pawns on the king side. So if white can get this queen away, and white does play queen h6 here, if you can get the bishop developed and bring this rook to the center of the board, like bishop f4 and rook d1, or even bishop e4, it's going to be very difficult once white completes the development. Additionally, the bishop on d4 looks very pretty, but both the pawns on b2 and f2 are guarded in this position, and the bishop takes away a square from the knight. The knight would love to go to d4 and then fork on e2. So Nepo plays queen e7. Magnus now goes bishop to f4, and here we get the move f5. Idea quite straightforward from Nepo. He creates a retreating diagonal for the bishop. It can go to f6 or g7, and then you bring the knight back to d4. Magnus goes e4 here, trying to open up the center of the board. We get bishop to g7, and now after queen to h5, it's looking quite dangerous here. White is threatening to capture the pawn on f5, and after we get the trade, now these two Bs are very, very active here. We've got two wooden shields in the middle of the board, and it's looking very, very dire. At this point, I'm going to be honest, when I was watching this live, I was thinking to myself, Magnus is going to win this game. This is a typical Magnus position. Very safe king, easy plays with two Bs, no risk, and Nepo under massive pressure. So we get f5 here, trying to stop the threat towards the pawn on h7. And now Magnus trades the bishop for the knight on c2, and we get the move rook b to d1. At this point, material is even, but because black has some weaknesses here, having pushed these pawns to e6 and f5, weaknesses on the diagonals as well, computer gives white a bit of an edge. Now, it's not winning or anything, but it's very hard to play. On the flip side, however, as you can tell from the clock, Nepo is up 2 minutes here. So because Nepo is up 2 minutes in this position, there are chances to try and confuse the situation. We get rook c8, Magnus goes queen to e2 here, and now we get to move a6, guarding the pawn on b5. Magnus plays rook takes rook, we get trade, and now we have rook to e1. Magnus trying to put massive pressure on the pawn on e6 here, so Nepo goes rook e8, guarding the pawn naturally. Now Magnus plays bishop to e5, and at this point you're thinking, well, even material pieces coming out the board should be a draw, but not so fast. And the reason it's not so fast is that you'll notice that white has this classic fianchetto structure, 3 pawns on the king side with the king, but because neither side has a light square B, the king is actually very safe on g1, while black has these serious issues on the open g file, the weak pawn on e6, and white can try to fight for the c or the d file as well. So even though material is even here, Magnus has quite an advantage. So we get the trade of the bishops. Nepo plays king to f7 here, trying to guard the pawn on e6 and then fight for either the c file or the d file with the rook. Magnus goes rook c1, and now we get queen to f6 being played. Now, if Nepo were to play rook c8, which is another move that might make sense, or rook d8, which might make sense here, Magnus is sort of spoiled for choice. First of all, he can go rook to c6. He can also play h4, which will lead to something very similar to the game. Either way, he has a lot of options. So, after rook to c1, we get to move queen to f6 from Nepo. Magnus plays queen d6. We get rook to e7, and now we have the move b4 being played. Worth pointing out in this position that one of the things white does not want to do is trade off a lot of pawns. So if white were to take on a6, after queen b2, white is still better here, but now you only have one set of pawns on the queen side, and now with 3 pawns on the king side, black's defending task becomes a lot easier. So we get b4, Magnus trying to keep the 2 sets of pawns on the queen side. Additionally, now he's threatening to capture the pawn on a6 as the pawn on b2 won't hang. Nepo goes queen to b2, and now we get queen to f4 back, guarding the pawn on b4 and the rook at the same time. Nepo goes king g6, and now we get to move h4, and here Magnus is starting to press a little bit. He wants to go queen g5 check, maybe h5, the king on g6 feeling very vulnerable, so Nepo plays h6 to stop queen g5. Magnus goes rook to c8, infiltrating with the rook, and now we get to move king to h7. Now this is a huge mistake after which Magnus should win the game. Computer prefers rook to d7 here, kind of ignoring all the checks, because if you check on g8, after king to h7, let's say you go queen b8, for example, now black can play rook to d1, you go king to g2, and after rook d2, all of a sudden the queen on b2 covers g7 and h8, and now you have a double stack on the second rank, and black is actually close to winning here. So instead, Nepo plays king h7. Mind you, I'm going to be honest, this is typical Magnus. He just puts the pressure, you feel uncomfortable, and you're trying to move fast, you don't want to get low on time, and this is simply a blunder, and black should lose the game. Magnus finds the best move, queen to d6. Now we get queen to g7 back, guarding the rook, and Magnus plays h5. Here, Nepo plays move e5, and this is a move that I think Nepo plays purely out of desperation here. If you don't play e5 or f4, what are you doing? You can't really move the queen to, say, b2, because then you hang the rook. If you go rook d7, you simply drop the pawn on e6. Now f5 and a6, everything is collapsing. So you can't really move the rook. You can't really move the queen. And with time winding down, at some moments, you've just got to make a decision and hope that you can find the counterplay. So we get e5. Magnus takes on a6. We get f4 played here. And at this point, white is up a pawn, and Magnus, if he uses his time correctly, should be winning. Now, Magnus has 1 minute 16 seconds on the clock. He spends 1 minute before playing a huge mistake, which is rook to c3. Now, what I suspect Magnus spent all his time on was queen takes pawn, and he probably thought after pawn takes pawn, queen to d3, checking the king, e4, and queen takes g3. And I'm guessing that Magnus must have seen the boogeyman here. I don't know if he was worried about queen to a1, king h2, and rook g7, for example. This might have been what he was worried about. Actually, this most likely is. Or he saw something like e3. Now, if black were to go e3, you just trade the queens, go king f1. And after rook f7, rook c2, white has 2 extra pawns on the queen side and will win very technically. So the line that I suspect Magnus missed is probably he thought after check king h2, rook g7, he was in all kinds of trouble here, and he simply did not see the winning move, which is rook to c7, pinning the rook on the 7th rank, also creating the classic 90-degree right triangle as well. Now, without rook to c7, white would be losing, because if you were to move the queen anywhere, now black can go queen to g1 check, king h3. I think you go queen to f1 check. If you go back, it's mate in uno. And if you go to h4, there's queen h1, queen h2. I take the queen, and you get laddered on the edge. So Magnus spends over a minute. He simply misses this idea of rook to c7. If he had seen rook c7, he would have 100% played queen takes ace, queen takes b5 on move 39, but instead he plays rook c3. And now after e4, the game is starting to spin out of control because Magnus is down to 10 seconds. Black is suddenly pushing p in the center of the board. There's a rook behind a passed pawn. There are threats towards g3 and c3. Black now has his own 90-degree right triangle, and Magnus basically decides here he's going to bail out with the move queen g6. Now, it's still quite good after this move queen to d6, but already here after rook to f7, say you play a move like rook to c5, for example, now after e3, it's getting very, very messy here. You're still probably winning with queen d3, but with no time on the clock, you don't want to take that risk. So Magnus decides to play queen g6. We get the trade, and now g takes f4, and here Jan plays rook a7. And at this point, with only rooks on the board combined with pawns and no real major imbalance, this should be a draw, as we'll see. We get rook c5, takes, rook b2, king f1, h5, rook g5, king f6, takes, and now it's a very clear draw. Even though white is probably going to end up 2 pawns on the f-file, this is a theoretical draw. We get here, takes, check, and now rook b2, rook c2, king g4, check, and rook b1. Basically, what black is doing here is whenever the king goes to g4, e4 to try and throw in this check, say black goes here and you get the check, and the king has to go back, black will never allow that. Whenever you check here, I go forward and I go back, vice versa. And whenever you go to e4 or whenever you go to g4, I will always tickle you and then go back. Same thing with e4, I tickle and then I go back, and this is quite straightforward. So Magnus goes rook a3, we get king f5, rook c3, rook a1, check, king f6, f5, king g5, king g3, check, and eventually the game will end in a draw here. No need to really go through it very much. We get to this position where Nepo starts checking the king all over the board. Magnus plays rook e5, and after rook to b1, king f3, rook f1, the game ends in a draw here. White cannot make progress. Whenever you go forward, I will just check and keep checking from the behind on the 8th rank. So, very disappointing second game for Magnus. He gets a winning position, very technical type of game, but he misses some basic tactics, and it does cost him a win in this game, which probably would have propelled him to an easy victory. So they draw in round number 2, and now let's move to the third game of the match where it's tied 1-1, and Nepo has the white pieces, and Magnus has the black pieces. So we get e4, c5 played by Magnus, knight f3, and now we get knight c6. In the first game of the match, Magnus actually played the classic Wrath of Khan system, I believe it was, with e6 and a6, and that was a draw. This time around, we get knight c6, we get knight c3, g6, d4, takes, and bishop g7. Now, I did not do a recap of this game of the Sinkfield Cup, but there was a famous game played between Fabiano Caruana with the black pieces and Ian Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces in that event, where Fabiano made a huge sacrifice in this dragon to crush Ian and get a resounding victory and propel himself into position to win the tournament. So, Ian obviously blundered in that game, but in this one, he probably has something better in mind. So we get bishop e3, guarding the knight on d4. We get knight to f6, and now we have the move bishop c4 being played. Magnus goes queen to a5 here, and we get this move f3 in this position. Now, worth pointing out that here the correct move is to simply castle your king out of the center of the board. And after black plays a move like d6, usually you'll go h3 to stop this knight g4 idea. And after castles and bishop b3, we've reached a standard starting position in this sort of accelerated dragon. I think it's still an accelerated dragon with bishop c4 and bishop b3. Instead, Nepo goes to f3, and now Magnus plays queen to b4, attacking the bishop and the pawn at the same time. Nepo goes bishop b3 to avoid hanging the pawn on b2, but now Magnus correctly sacks the knight with knight takes e4 here, and suddenly you see the power of the classic dragon, or the classic fianchetto dragon bishop here on g7. If white were to take, all of a sudden after bishop takes d4, takes, black simply has an extra pawn in the center of the board and is close to winning. So Nepo takes on c6, we got bishop takes knight, takes, king to e2, and now we have the very important move d takes c6 being played. Now this move is very important because you're thinking, well, wait, free horse, I just take. But if you take the horse, there's bishop g4 checking the king, and after the king moves, you lose the queen and the game. Additionally, if you were to play the move bishop d4, which might look very good, you're hitting the queen and the rook at the same time. Black has a very nasty move, pawn to e5 here, attacking the bishop, because now you can no longer take the rook, and if you take the queen, I take your bishop with check, forking the king and the queen, And now after takes, and say f6, black is an extra pawn here in the center of the board in an endgame and will easily win. So Nepo plays the move rook to e1 instead. And at this point, when you do the count, you'll notice that black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And Magnus is simply up 2 pawns here. On the flip side, however, he's lacking a development and white has these 2 Bs. So black has to react very carefully. Now Magnus here sacks the queen by playing queen takes bishop. We get takes. And now we have knight c3 check, forking the king and the queen, king d2, knight takes queen. And here Jan actually keeps his nerves and finds the best move in the position, which is this move rook takes a7, completely ignoring this horse on d1. Now, it's a very important point because if white were to take on d1, for example, after a6, black is simply up 2 pawns in this endgame and will easily win this position. So we get rook takes pawn. Now, if black were to play knight takes bishop here, now you can take the rook and suddenly both the knight and the bishop are hanging and black is going to lose a lot of material. So therefore, Magnus trades the rooks. We get the move bishop takes rook being played, and now Magnus goes f6. If the knight goes to f2, e3, or c3, all 3 of these squares are covered and you lose the horse. And if you go to b2, there is simply bishop to d4 here, hitting the rook and the knight. And black is still up a pawn here, but the game should be completely close to a draw. So we get f6 instead from Magnus here. We got bishop c5, and now we have the move e5. Black's trying to build a bit of a central pawn chain here, but Nepo plays the move rook takes knight. Magnus goes g5, and now we get the move king to e3. And oddly enough, even though black is up 1 pawn here, because white controls this d file here, and on top of that, it being opposite colored b's, white actually is not in all that much trouble, even though Nepo very clearly blundered in the opening. We get h5. Magnus goes Magnus goes h5. Nepo goes c4. We get king f7, and now we have bishop b6. And the idea here is quite simple. White wants to go rook to d8, simply forcing a trade of the rooks here. And even though black has 1 extra pawn, because it's opposite colored bishops, this will be a draw every time. So Magnus goes bishop f5, trying to avoid the forced trade. Nepo plays rook d8 anyway, and now we get rook takes rook. Now, maybe Magnus could have tried rook to h7 here to keep the game going, but after rook to b8, let's just say king g6, I think white can just check all over the place, and eventually you're probably still going to have to trade. Maybe there's a way to go king h6 perhaps, but again, after rook f8, it's probably the same thing. There's no way to dodge the repetition. So Magnus decides to trade the rooks, and now we get bishop c2, b4, and at this point, this game will be a draw. We have bishop b3, c5, bishop d5, and now Nepo plays g3. We get king g6, h4, g4, f4 is played here. Important, by the way, to not create these pawn imbalances. This is still a draw here, but you don't want to create the imbalances. And when you go f4, now all these pawns are on the opposite color of the black light square bishop, and the rest is rudimentary. So after f4, we get king f5, takes, bishop c7, bishop f7. And here we got Jan basically waiting forever with the bishop. We got bishop g6, bishop h8. After e4, we now get to move bishop c3. Worth pointing out here, by the way, that if white were to go bishop f6, king c4, bishop d8 takes, and bishop b6, this still would actually be a draw, even though black has 2 extra pawns here, because you can't make use of the extra pawn on b7. The bishop and the pawn guard each other, and white will always yo-yo with the king back and forth. Nepo plays bishop c3, also completely fine. We get king c4, bishop e1, and now we get bishop d2, bishop e1, and bishop d2. And at this point, there's no way to break the fortress, as Jan will simply repeat forever in ad infinitum with bishop e1 and bishop d2. We got bishop g8, bishop e1, and here Magnus agrees to draw, because simply put, after bishop d5, bishop d2, if you go king d1 to stop bishop e1, there's bishop c3, d2, and you go here, there always are multiple yo-yo mods. You put the bishop on c3 and d2, or e1 and d2, either way, there's no way to break the fortress. So this game ends in a draw, probably a little bit disappointing for Magnus again in this third game to not win, because it's clear that Nepo blundered in the opening, but on the flip side, Nepo also defended very well after that mistake. So the players would draw their fourth game as well and be tied 2-2, and they go to the classic Armageddon game. So in the Armageddon game, I'm not quite sure what Nepo's bid was, but Magnus bid 7 minutes and 25 seconds, meaning he got the black pieces and the draw odds. So Jan must win with the white pieces against Magnus. So we get c4. Magnus plays the e5. As you see, 10 minutes versus 7:25. Can Nepo take advantage of the 2 minute and 35 second advantage? We get knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, and now we have the move e3 being played. Here Nepo plays d5. It's worth pointing out that in his match against Ding, I believe in 2023, there bishop b4 and queen c2 was played. I think that was the game that Ding won with the white pieces, or maybe it was the other way around. I forget exactly who had white, who had black, but this position with bishop b4, queen c2 was featured in that match. So instead, we get d5 here from Magnus, takes, takes. We get bishop b5, takes, takes. And now we have to move bishop d6, d4, and queen to f6. Now, this is a line that I've not looked at very recently, but I actually remember having had this position with the white piece. I believe it was in 2018 or 2019 against Surya Sekhar Ganguly from India in one of the Tata Steel events in Kolkata. So this is a position that I had played back then. I also believe that I had this with the black piece against none other than Magnus Carlsen in one of the events in the Magnus Carlsen Tour in 2020. It might have been the finals or one of the other events, but I also have had this position with black against Magnus. So Magnus familiar with white and black. Many of these openings, of course, played by all the top players. We get d5. Magnus goes to a6 here. Of course, he can't move the horse because it's pinned, so you got to attack the b. We get bishop e2, and now Magnus moves the knight away. No longer is there a pin on the file, and black will try to reroute the knight to d7. We get castles, knight to d7, and now we have the move c4 being played. Now, this is simply a bad move by Nepo. What he should have played here was something like either e4 or e4 to either open up the diagonal here for the dark square b, or knight d2 trying to put the knight on either e4 or c4. Instead, we get the move c4, and now Magnus rather surprisingly decides to castle the king. Now, the computer here is screaming for this move e4, and I believe after knight d4, either castles or knight to e5 should both be good for black, with the b's lined up on the diagonals. I guess knight e5 isn't good because it's some weird bishop a3 idea, and if you take, there's some queen a4. At any rate, very, very dank. Magnus decides to castle instead, and now we get bishop b2. Now, one interesting point is that Jan continues to refuse to play this move pawn to e4, which is quite interesting to think about, because to me, e4 seems very logical for a couple of reasons. First of all, if black can ever go, let's just say e4, you open up this long scope for the dark square b on d6. Additionally, when the knight moves, you can play knight e5 or knight c5. Let's just say c5 to illustrate the point. And both these b's are on great diagonals, whereas your bishop on e2 is very passive here. And the bishop on c1 is going to have to go to this b2 diagonal, which is not terrible, but it doesn't feel quite as good to me. So it's interesting that Nepo actually refuses to play e4 in this position, which would also, by the way, lock up this diagonal. Bishop is now dead on this diagonal. There's nothing to do. But instead, we get bishop b2. Magnus plays knight c5 here, stopping white from ever going e4. And now we have the move knight d2. Magnus plays queen to g6, sliding the queen out of the pin on this diagonal. And now already it's clear that Magnus has the better end of it. And on top of that, you'll notice he's only down 20 seconds on the clock. So we get the move king to h1, trying to dodge a bishop h3 trap. Say you were to play a4. There might be a bishop h3 idea here with all kinds of pressure. After bishop f3, I guess e4 doesn't quite work. But nonetheless, actually, when I look at this position, black should never be worse here at all. So we get king h1, trying to dodge the bishop h3 threat. And now Magnus goes bishop to f5, once again stopping white from playing e4, but also considering e4 himself and giving himself the chance to bring the rook to e8. We get to move rook to c1. Magnus plays b6 here. This is simply a move to protect the bastion on c5 here. Maybe not the only move, maybe not necessary, but I like it from the standpoint of it's an Armageddon game. You want to move quickly, and it just makes a lot of sense. We get f3, and now Magnus plays bishop to d7 here, and we get the move e4. Now, Nepo has played f3 and e4, and he finally has built a sort of big white center. But on the other hand here, now black can play for f5 to weaken the white center, and if anything, I would say black should be better. So we get f5 from Magnus. Here we have f4 being played, and this is actually a very good decision here. You're probably thinking, well, takes, for example. White is just getting outplayed, and the reason white is getting outplayed here is, say you play knight b3, for example. Black has knight to d3, and after takes, let's just say rook f2. Now there's e4. You have both of the b's on the diagonals. You have the rooks on the f and potentially the e files. All of white's pieces are completely misplaced. But Nepo does find f4, and the good thing about this is now there's some chaos in the center of the board, and if Magnus is not super precise and he has spent 2 or 3 minutes and he makes a blunder, he could lose the game. So here we got the move rook a8, and this is just a huge blunder for Magnus. But again, it's a tough spot. 5 minutes, 33 seconds, no increment. What do you do? Now, the computer prefers f takes e4. Honestly, I'm shocked that after takes and bishop e7, apparently black is better. Honestly, after a move like bishop d4, let's just say takes and knight to f1, with white having this classic connector in the center of the board, just to illustrate something like this, for example, it's really hard to believe that white isn't better here, but the computer actually doesn't care whatsoever. So Magnus plays rook a8 right away, and this blunders a very nasty shot. Bishop to h5, attacking the queen, and now Magnus Carlsen is going to lose some material. Now, I wasn't watching this game live, so I don't know if this was actually blunder or it was intended, but he has to go queen to h6. Now we get takes, and at this point, Nepo is up a rook for a bishop here. Should be completely fine in the center of the board if he plays it correctly, and he will get a match victory. So we get f takes e5. Magnus correctly decides to sack the rook with rook takes pawn, not bishop takes, because after takes, and let's just say e takes f5. Now black has a bishop for a rook, but again, in this position, white has more time. White will move the knight to f3, and the material advantage should be too great to overcome. So Magnus sacks the rook, and now we get bishop takes rook, bishop takes bishop, and here we have the move knight f3. Now at this point, Magnus has 2 b's in return for 2 towers. White's guarding h2, attacking the bishop. It's looking very, very Gucci. We get bishop to f4 here, and now we have this move e5 being played. Now this move is not necessarily losing the game, but it's worth pointing out that the computer prefers d6 here, which is a very tough move to play, by the way, because now if black were to take, you can go queen to d5, king to h8, gets ice skated by queen to a8 check. And if you go to f8 here, now white can simply play rook to e1. And whenever you play a move like knight e4, I sack the rook. And after takes, queen e4, suddenly the f file is open. There's queen a8, there's h3, g3, and white will win the game. Now, Nepo is 542, and he plays this move e5 in about 20 seconds. And in my opinion, this is just not good time usage by Nepo here. With 542 versus 506, this is a spot where the position is going to clarify very, very quickly based on the next 3 or 4 moves. And it feels like a spot where you probably should use 2 to 3 minutes to try and work it out. Instead, he uses 20 seconds before playing e5, and now we get knight to e4, and suddenly Magnus is jumping with this knight. It can go to f2 or g3. There's pressure on h2, pressure on c1, and it's anybody's guess what's going to happen. Nepo plays queen to e1, and this is just a blunder which loses the game. The only move to stay in the game here is rook to c2, and the reason this move is so vital is that let's just say you play a move like rook to a1 to illustrate the point. I can go check. It's actually going to be the same thing as the game. King g1, check, and after knight e4, you're going to lose this rook on f2 for nothing. So all of a sudden, you lose one of the towers for nothing, which means that in the long run, let's just say something like this, for example. Now black has 2 b's for a rook. Remember, it was 2 b's for 2 rooks, and now it's only 2 b's for 1 rook. What on earth is going on? So Nepo plays the move queen e1 after a bit of a thing, so at least he used some time, but rook c2 would have been the only move here to try and keep the advantage. After check, king g1 check. Now after rook f2 and knight e4, you have the other tower guarding the rook on f2. So you can go king to f1, takes, and here with the 3 connected pawns in the center of the board, white should be winning anyway. Instead, Nepo plays queen to e1, and now we get knight to g3, king g1, and here Magnus simply takes the rook on f1, and all of a sudden you can't take the horse because then you lose the rook, and just like that, Magnus Carlsen has swindled Ian Nepomniachtchi yet again, and he is going to win this game and the match. We get the move e6 being played. Magnus goes bishop to e8. We get rook c3, and now we have the move knight takes h2. As you can see, white might have a connector in the center, but both of these b's are blockading the critical squares here. You're not getting anything in the center of the board, and now your king side is collapsing, and it's simply a catastrophe. Nepo goes rook a3. We get bishop d6, rook takes a6, and now we have the move bishop c5. And here Nepo, I believe, resigns the game because he simply can't do anything. If he plays queen f2, it's a Botez gambit, and now with only a rook versus a, let's just say here on queen g6 takes h5. With a rook versus a queen and a bishop, it's no match, obviously, so that doesn't work. If you go knight d4, I take, and after king h1, I have knight f3, creating the classic fossil. I check the king and discover the queen, and after queen h4, it is checkmate on the spot. Last but not least is king to h1, the only other option. Takes queen h4, which is also checkmate. So that is why Ian Nepomniachtchi resigns this game and loses the Armageddon and the match as well to Magnus Carlsen. So for Magnus, maybe not the best day at the office. A couple of chances in games 2 and 3 to win, wasn't able to. Armageddon, very shaky as well. But when it comes down to it, and this really is a point I cannot stress enough, Magnus is simply consistent. He might not always find the best moves, but when it really matters, he's able to buckle down and keep it together. And in this case, or this game, I should say, it's very clear to me that Ian Nepomniachtchi's nerves simply failed him. And it's one of the biggest strengths that Magnus Carlsen has in terms of, well, I should say on top of everything else, in terms of being the best player in the world. So Magnus gets the win. That means that he moves on to the next round in Division 1. Ian will still be in Division 1, but he is in the loser's bracket. So if he loses one more match, he will be eliminated, whereas Magnus still has 2 lives left. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the first round of the Julius Baer Generational Cup, which is part of the Chess Champions Tour being held on chess.com. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps in the coming days. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day. See you. Bye.